In 1963, Sir Bernard Lavelle, under the USSR's instructions, told NASA's Deputy Administrator, Hugh Dryden, that the Russians could see no immediate way of protecting cosmonauts from the lethal effects of solar radiation. Were the Russians lying?
If the Soviets were lying, it certainly wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. There was a great deal of political posturing and rhetorical gameplay in those days. The Soviets could very well have been using Lovell as a means of trying to pry into our technology.
What could the Soviets possibly have to gain from America's inferior technology? Right from day one, Russian cosmonauts always had the privileged luxury of riding in a spacecraft with a sea-level pressure, nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, because the Russians have always had their mighty R-7 Semyorka to lift the heavy walls needed to contain such an atmosphere. The Americans had to wait until 1981 to have that pleasure. Until then, they were riding in lightweight capsules with a low-pressure, pure oxygen atmosphere, launched atop rockets with very little lifting capacity. Even the Saturn V couldn't deliver this.
They were making overtures to a joint mission to the moon with the United States.
And we all know what eventually became of that. ASTP, Mir, the ISS, and various other joint projects between Russia and the US.
But we were suspicious of their intentions. The real reason for their apparent unwillingness to continue with the race to the moon was more economic than anything else, but they had too much pride to admit that.
False. The USSR had proven their capabilities with their Zonda program, a project to send a Soyuz capsule minus the orbital module around the moon launched by a Proton rocket. And despite Leonov's pleas to fly it, the Russians refused. 3 weeks later, the USSR lost out to Apollo 8. Clearly, it wasn't a matter of economy.
And we knew that we were unable to protect astronauts from a huge solar flare like, for example, the Seahorse. And unfortunately, none of them occurred during the Apollo missions.
False. The records show that over the total time the astronauts supposedly spent in cislunar space, there were 30 major X-ray flares. I discussed these in depth in my earlier reply to Joseph Grutt. I'll put a link in the sidebar.
We stuck our necks out and took the risks, where the Soviets were beginning to opt for unmanned missions. By the way, if there had been a terrible solar flare and if astronauts had died as the result of it, you would be claiming that they were heroes because one of them was going to rat on the NASA fake moon missions, and so they murdered them.
I don't cry murder without valid proof of such. If an astronaut did die in cislunar space as a result of solar radiation exposure, I would point to this mission as proof against all the other Apollo flights, as even the minor flares can hurt you. And historically, there were 1,400 of them during all the past moon missions.
The Soviets lied a lot in those days, and nothing they said could be trusted.
And yet, you trust that they honestly put probes and people into space? You trust them when they say Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space. You trust them when they say Alexei Leonov was the first man to walk in space. And yet, you don't trust them when they warn NASA of the dangers of solar radiation. Great logic there.
Any more than most of what you say. For example, didn't you say this?
And all these questions come direct from primary sources.
These were 3 British conspiracist authors with a serious axe to grind and attitude against the United States and the Apollo program. Here's a synopsis I found of their book. It is described as a ponderous anti-Apollo broadside. This book seeks to cast aspersions on the entire space program. And yet you say,
and all these questions come direct from primary sources, not some spurious article against the primary source. Astrobrant, did you even read the book? It's hardly spurious. The only thing anti-Apollo about the book is that the authors question whether it was worth $30 billion to go to the moon when the Russians were not involved in the race to begin with. They also blame the deaths of the Apollo 1 crew on reckless negligence by NASA and North American aviation. They also question the honesty of the investigation, as all the investigators were those directly involved in the disaster. As far as their axes to grind against the US government goes, the authors simply feel that the whole point of going to the moon was more political than scientific. If the astronauts came in peace for all mankind, as stated, then wouldn't planting the UN flag on the moon have been a more appropriate choice than planting the Stars and Stripes? Otherwise, the book is your average mainstream account of the official Apollo story. Now, it later turned out that the Soviets were indeed involved in the race. The existence of their N-1 moon program was never made public until after the fall of the USSR, long after this book was written. I can't fault the authors on an erroneous stance based on info that had not surfaced at the time, but I'd agree that the overall decision to go to the moon was more political than anything else. Quite frankly, anyone who has studied Apollo would know that it's difficult for space historians not to acknowledge that. Though they never called it murder, I'd say their coverage of the Apollo 1 fire is fairly accurate. In the same video, Astrobrad himself said there may be negligence in the Challenger disaster.
People made wrong decisions, and there may even be negligence involved in their failure to take greater precautions and their failure to delay the launch.
He also admitted that Frank Borman was not very honest during his testimony to Congress regarding the fire. Was Frank Borman, the thermodynamics teacher, who must therefore have surely known about bomb calorimeters, being honest when he told Congress and the Senate that none of them were truly aware of the hazard of pure oxygen?
I do not believe that Frank Borman was being completely honest when he made that statement. To tell the truth, I don't know why he made it. I think he would have been better off just admitting that they knew that the test was risky.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Roger, go with throttle up. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
History is not always pretty. You can sugarcoat it all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that NASA did some bad things in the past. Dismissing a book as spurious simply because they accuse NASA of negligence is hardly a justifiable excuse for dismissing the source. Jay Windley claims moon rocks contain no water and have no evidence of the presence of water in their formation. Do you agree? Or do you go by this other statement from Windley?
As a matter of raw observation, lunar samples have always shown a barely detectable amount of water.
Let me give you an illustration. If someone were to ask you, what are some of the major differences between the Earth and the Moon? Wouldn't one of your answers probably be that the Earth has an atmosphere and the Moon doesn't? But technically the Moon does have an atmosphere. It's just extremely rarefied, and would not really be necessary to mention in the context of that question. Then at some later time you're discussing this nearly non-existent atmosphere and what its composition is, and someone comes along and goes, Ooh, you're contradicting yourself. You're a liar. I'm going to tell the world. This all proves that we never went to the moon. I'm going to expose you for the fraud that you are. Over and 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 over.
Unlike you, I have no need to quote mine. Oh, please. There is no comparison between the atmospheres of the Earth and Moon and the water contents of Earth rocks and Apollo samples. Let me give you an illustration. To measure density, we measure in atoms per cubic centimeter. In other words, how many atoms of any said element are packed into each cubic centimeter of space. The lunar atmosphere consists mostly of argon and helium and has a density of 80,000 atoms per cubic centimeter, meaning every cubic centimeter has 80,000 of these argon and helium atoms squashed into it. 80,000 atoms may sound like a lot, but in terms of atmospheric pressure, it only works out to be 0 psi, making it virtually non-existent. At sea level, the Earth's atmosphere has a density of 10 to the 19 atoms per cubic centimeter. For those who don't understand scientific notation, that's a 1 followed by 19 zeros. Yeah, that's a lot of atoms. Now for the water in the Earth rocks and Apollo rocks. For those keeping score, the rocks and soil that Friedman studied contained 455 parts per million and 810 parts per million respectively. And I must emphasize, Friedman assured us that these numbers are comparable to that of terrestrial basalts. Now at the time Astro Brandt released his video, the confirmed amount of water in the spherules was still only 46 parts per million. But Sal's estimates for the actual contents of water were between 260 parts per million and 745 parts per million, which incidentally is also comparable to that of volcanic glasses found on Earth. And finally, the rocks that Argel studied contain water as high as 1000 parts per million to 1500 parts per million, hardly a rarefied amount. They are by all means comparable to the 150 parts per million to 10,000 parts per million for terrestrial rocks. And as you'll see later on, more recent studies have shown even higher water contents in NASA's samples. In simplicity, the Earth rocks and Apollo samples have exactly the same water concentrations. The Earth and Moon do not have the same atmospheric densities. So, Duckboy, which claim by Windley do you stick with? His claim that moon rocks have no water and contain no evidence of the presence of water in their formation? Or his claim that moon rocks have always shown a so-called barely detectable amount of water? Until you answer this properly, I'll be adding this to your list of questions you dodged.